whenever you started.
Go. And action.
Okay, good morning. Just a real quick check-in, because I was talking to somebody. Does everyone have access to the class in Canvas?
Oh, that's a great question.
Okay, so,
Take a look.
okay, I need to work on that. So the classes are published?
I don't think so, because it's grayed out, and I can't
Okay.
select it to open the class. So I just think you have to deactivate it.
I have to activate it?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, so I will do that, because all the stuff is on there. For the different assignments and articles. So that's published, but I guess I have to actually publish the class itself. So I'll find out how to do that. So definitely that I'll work on that today so you can have access, because what you'll find on there is the article that you would be reviewing, as well as the guide for reviewing an article, as well as all the assignments that you'll be submitting. You'll be submitting it through Canvas, so all those assignments are there with the due dates and everything. So we'll figure out what that last kind of switch is to kind of get things going. Today we're going to be meeting abbreviated because of a week of spiritual emphasis. So we'll meet to about 10:30. Today we'll be kind of again continuing our conversation from last week, a little bit more in depth and kind of specifically in relation to its application to couples and families. So kind of last week we had started to talk about kind of different methodologies, qualitative and quantitative methodologies. And so I wanted to kind of go over the different types of quantitative methodologies again, and then what are the purpose, and then how would you apply them to couples. So one is survey research, and so as we discussed with survey research, basically we want to select a sample of respondents, and then we survey those respondents. And as part of that surveying of respondents, you don't follow? Oops. Yeah, no problem. As part of surveying those respondents, we hope that we will gather information from a smaller representative sample or group or people to infer conclusions. So from what you remember, a representative sample would be what? Do you remember?
Part of a specific population, is that correct? Like it represents, I don't know.
Generalizable.
So it allows it to be generalizable if it's representative.
Yes.
So
Oh, yeah. Like there's, okay, yeah, you can just explain it, but I think
So when we think about a representative sample, essentially we're wanting to collect a sample that has the qualities, the overall qualities of a larger population that we're trying to examine.
That's exactly what it is.
So there it is. So I'm sure not to jump on it next time, right? So that's what we're wanting to kind of look at. There's different ways of doing it, right? So you have in-person surveys, you have online questionnaires. There's even different ways you can actually ask the interview questions face-to-face, or you can actually do self-report. Now, again, when we think about this in terms of consideration of couples and families, how do we want to start thinking about, if we were conducting survey, what types of variables we would want to consider, right? So for example, if you were doing interviews, what types of considerations might we want to have if we were thinking about couples? If we were doing survey research here, you know, what are the different configurations? So let's first think about configurations. If I'm doing survey research with a couple or a family, what are the different configurations that I might use in order to gather this information? When I say configuration, meaning what are the different ways that I could then get this information from the couple or family?
Individually or as a couple?
So one would be, you know, do I interview both couples together? I mean, do I interview the couple together? Do I interview them individually? Are there other configurations? So do we have, if this is a survey, you know, do I actually interview them individually and then as a couple? right? So again, and there's different reasons why you would maybe use these different configurations, right? So one would be, is the information that I am assessing for likely to be influenced by the other partner, right? So I may do it separately, right? But also there's also a phenomenon that takes place when they're being interviewed together. We talked a little about that last week. What about if you're filling it out online? What types of considerations would we want to have in place if we're having them fill it out online? How would we have a couple fill it out online?
It'd be hard to yeah, well, it'd be hard to know if they're like looking over each other's shoulders, or if they're like I remember once I gave a couple a packet that they were like just an intake packet to fill out in the waiting room, and they were like looking over each other's shoulders. I was like, stop it! This is not group effort. Like I will separate you.
Well, and that's exactly right. So and so these are one of the things that in terms of when you even give your survey instructions, you have to be much more explicit. Please fill this out away from your partner. Please make sure that your partner are not looking at your answers. This is, make sure that they are not discussed. Please do not discuss your answers with your partner. That as you're looking at, doing this with families and couples, there are things that we would want to think about. Now, again, if we think about multiple individuals that we're surveying, and we now translate this into like parents and children, what new things do we now want to think about or consider? Well, number one, if it's a child, there's can they read, right? So now you're looking at issues of literacy and comprehension. And so you may say, how old is the child? Does the instrument that I want to give to them, appropriate to their reading level, to their developmental level? And therefore, is this particular methodology the best for trying to kind of get at some of those areas? And might there be some other things that I would want to consider if I'm trying to select a research method and looking at couples and families? So we talked about survey research, and then you have clinical research. When we think about clinical research specifically, it's an in-depth examination of a person or a family, typically, as the word suggests, around a clinical issue. So these are individuals that typically a psychiatrist, psychologist, measurement therapist, social worker, some other type of professional goes in and does an in-depth interview. I think Sean is actually maybe doing a little bit of clinical, I'm not sure. But when you actually go in and there's an identified clinical issue, and I'm doing an in-depth interview or something along those lines, right? So typically case studies or case study types of methodologies fall into clinical research. What's the purpose? So to understand specific clinical issues and concerns, as well as how families create roles, patterns, rules that members follow without being aware of them, right? So when we're thinking about clinical research, one of the limitations, let me ask, what would be one of the limitations of clinical research?
The setting, actual access.
So access to the population.
I guess depending on how you're viewing it, if you're viewing different psychiatrists or different therapists or whatever, the way that they apply whatever methodology could be a little bit different from person to person, and so
that is a variable, right? So there is the therapist variable that is there. You have tests for fidelity to try to maintain, to make sure that level of consistency is there. One of the limitations is generalizability, right? Because it's a clinical sample, so you can't generalize it to a broader population, right? But there are some very important work that has been done. For example, there was some great research that was done by Judith Weinsgard, I think, Judith Weinsgard, who actually looked at couples who were divorcing. So she specialized in kind of running a practice around couples who were divorcing. And she studied these couples over 25 years and then wrote 3 volumes about the various, things that we should be mindful of as clinicians when working with couples dealing with divorce, right? And it became a seminal work in relation to understanding what's happening with divorced families. So clinical research is very important, particularly if we're trying to better understand a particular type of clinical phenomenon, right? we're trying to understand how does this kind of play out within these families. Now, what's interesting is it takes on a very interesting twist when we now start to think about families, right? Because if you're studying depression among individuals, then you can kind of take these individuals and study them and study their context. But then now, as we think about families, and clinical research, there's now an additional layer that we're kind of looking at. And so again, how do we start to kind of think about if we were going to try to do clinical research with families? What are some important considerations that we would want to start to kind of think about?
I kind of always go narrative in a sense and ask, like, if you're studying depression within a family, you're really asking, like, what is the story of depression? What has it been maybe throughout a couple generations? Have you actually seen it in like an aunt or an uncle? Did you see it in multiple people? What was that kind of expression like? So.
Yeah, and I think that you're getting right at it, which is we have to start conceptualizing phenomena at the relational level. Right? So depression is no longer an individual phenomenon. Right? That we're now looking at depression as really a relational phenomenon. What does depression look like within a relational context? Right? So we're no longer even just capturing the symptomology of what we would consider or classify as depression. We're now moving into what does depression mean within this context, and how do these meanings not only just influence the course of the illness within a particular individual, but how do those meanings influence family processes? How does that meaning influence family interactions? Right. So now as you're setting up your case study, you can kind of start to see how it might influence some of the questions that you would ask. Right. So if you're asking, you'll be asking more than just how long have you had the condition, which is good, right? But you would want to start to expand it. Right? And so if you were expanding, so now think about this, right? So I want you to now think about a case study at a relational level, at a family level. Let's take depression. Right? What types of questions, if we were now doing a case study on the family and we wanted to understand the role of depression within the family context, what would be some of the questions that you would want to consider from a systems relational perspective?
How the other family members are influenced? How the other family members perceive and
how do other family members perceive the depression? You can go ahead.
How is it defined?
How is defined, right? How is depression defined between the family, among family members? Right? Who even believes whether depression exists at all? Right? What else? The interaction. So when John is depressed, or when he reports being depressed, what does the family do? Right? How does the family start to reorganize around that? So you can kind of start to see, how while it's the same methodology, when we start to include these couples and families, it starts to shift even how we start to ask some of these questions. Right? And that becomes important because, again, as you move and matriculate into various contexts, one of the things that we would bring, because we have this systems relational perspective, is as research questions are starting to be asked, we start to offer this additional layer that sometimes is not always considered. So we have clinical research. Then you have observational research. We talked a little bit about this last time as well. Observational research, scholars essentially try to attempt to through direct observation, observe a particular phenomena and remain as unobtrusive as possible. Right? The purpose is they want to try to observe the behavior in a naturalistic type setting. With minimal intrusion, interference, or manipulation to track natural processes and interaction. So, thinking about it now, when might observational research be relevant? Why would someone take an observational methodology as compared to a survey or clinical research methodology?
So those are things like when I like studied attachment, like that's a difficult instrument to like a difficult process to assess attachment. So that's when like the strain situation or something like that protocol would be helpful, like how observing the parent and child interaction. Otherwise, that it's an infant or a toddler, how else would you assess it?
So that's a great one, right? So within a family context, one of the things that you would want to start to observe is I can't really ask a child, are you securely attached? Are you anxiously attached? What's your general vibe with you and mom, right? That it would be very difficult to try and get at that, right? Similarly, if we were going to survey research and we just, obviously the child is unable to fill out the survey, if we get mom's self-report, she's only offering her perspective on what the relationship is, right? So, and may not necessarily be in a clinical setting, right? So attachment is a universal phenomenon. Some people argue with that, but I think most people would agree that attachment is a universal phenomenon. So we would want to use an observational design because it would be best captured by watching the observation, watching the phenomenon. So when you look at some of the classic studies around some of these things, right? That the mother's there, and then the mother leaves the room, and what does the child do? Right? When the child turns their face to the mother, and the mother maintains a flat affect, what does the child do? Right? So the researchers can now observe what's happening, and then from there start to make certain inferences and conclusions. And they want to try to be as reduce the amount of influence as much as possible because they want the interaction to be as close to reality as possible as well. And so this is good illustration there.
Is that sort of what that's what Gottman did, right?
This is what Gottman, yes, he did this in addition to, right?
And,
so he did some survey, but he definitely did some observation, right? He wanted. Now, what are some of the limitations of observational research, right? So some of the limitations would be that even though I'm trying to be natural, right? If I know I'm being observed, it influences my behavior, right? So for the mom who's in the lab and we're studying attachment, we may give them minimal information, but for the mere fact that I know that I'm being observed, my interaction to my child may start to change. And so the more information that I know, the more likely it's going to influence my behavior, right? So this is why oftentimes with observational, they try to provide as little information as possible, so to not influence what may be going on. Then we have experimental research. Experimental research is probably what we're familiar with. This is when researchers isolate a single factor under controlled circumstances to determine its influence. The purpose is to evaluate the influence of a particular variable within an identified context. So this is a lot of when we look at our research on various clinical models or various clinical interventions, they're doing experimental research. Again, as we think about translating this now into the relational context, there are variables that we would want to consider and be mindful of. So when we think about experimental research, how might we have to set up the design a little bit differently if we were thinking about couples and families?
You can't prescribe a lot of the treatment conditions, right? So you can't prescribe a couple to be divorcing. So there's going to be a lot of risk of confounding factors of if you're trying to understand the mechanisms that couples use to negotiate during a divorce, those couples are not going to be representative of your typical couple out in the real world.
Right.
because something led them to divorce, and that in and of itself can be confounding. So if it makes it much more difficult to generalize because you don't know, you can't control for all these other factors.
And that's, I think that's the big piece is oftentimes particularly within the social context, these end up being not true experimental designs, but more quasi-experimental designs. Right? Primarily because, one, we can't oftentimes have a very pure control group because it would be unethical, right? And then we can't always control all the other confounding variables that we would need to take into consideration. So, for example, the role of kids when it comes to divorce, right? And so we may not be in a very happy relationship, but I may not get divorced as a result of this other confounding variable. How does that kind of play into the decision-making process? And so when we're looking at experimental designs, one of the big things that we have to consider are all of the confounders. Right? What are the different confounding variables that we would want to consider? Right? So obviously from an individual level, and let me see if we remember. So what are some of the, when you think about social science research in general, right? And some of the basic confounding variables that are included in most any study, what would you say are the top 5?
Top 5 confounding factors?
Top 5 variables that people say, if you're gonna, whatever research you're doing, you're probably gonna need to include some of these variables. They've been found time and time again to be important confounders.
Like demographics?
Yeah.
Like the age of your
age, right?
participants.
Mm-hmm. SES, right? Socioeconomic status.
Disability status?
Hmm?
Disabilities?
In certain research, but that's not usually not usually one that is just kind of almost ubiquitously. Yeah. Race, ethnicity, yes.
And then
Gender, okay.
Location.
Census, definitely that, but usually a census is sometimes a proxy for SES, or socioeconomic status, right? So you have age, you have gender, you have race, culture, you have what's the other one? SES. The other one that's pretty common is marital status, right? Or relationship status. Right? That's kind of another one. So those typically, like, as you set up a study, those are kind of almost off the bat, we're going to need to kind of put those in. Right? Now, from a relational context, what other variables? So let's first look at the couple level, and then let's look at the family level. Right? What other variables would be often kind of almost should always be considered as you're thinking about doing research in couples and families? Yeah.
I'll throw this one out there, like how many kids?
Kids, that's exactly right. Right? So how many kids are within the family? Now why might that be an important variable?
Because that influences the relationship and the dynamics of the family. That influences the parental relationship and the dynamics of the family.
It influences parenting, it influences finances, it influences time, it influences stress. So all of those would be important variables. So how many kids that you have? What else? What other things would we want to consider as important variables when we think about now knowing that we're going to be studying a couple or family?
If we're working with a blended family or more nuclear.
That's exactly right. Are they divorced? Are they remarried? So we would want to develop a much more sophisticated response category for marital status. Right? Typically speaking, you have married, not married, married, single, divorced, that kind of like your standard 3, right? But when you're really starting to look at, if you're going to be studying families and couples, it has to be much more nuanced, right? So what would be important response categories that you would want to include as part of that, right? So we already know married, right? We already know divorced. We already know single. Those are the most common. But what other types of statuses would be important? Are you separated?
Widowed.
Are you widowed?
Sometimes people are like in serious committed relationships and they've cohabitated for
Are you
10 years.
cohabitating? Right? Are you engaged? You know, are you in a long-term relationship?
Is it a monogamous relationship or is there other status?
Is it monogamous? I mean, see, these become important variables because this is going to influence some of the responses that you'll be getting as you're starting to engage them in the research process. So again, as you're moving into studying a couple or a family, you would want to kind of slow down and say, what would be in terms of in terms of relationship configuration. I would want to consider this. You would want to look. You would want to see. Is this a step family? Is this a blended family? You would want to even get into. We haven't talked about it, but we would want to talk about same sex, intersex, transgender, transitioning. All of these become important statuses to kind of consider as we're moving into the relational context. Okay, so we've talked about marital status. Are there other things that we would want to think about when we're moving into trying to study couples and families? So we talked about number of kids. We talked about marital status. Yeah.
On number of kids, like were there like any fertility problems? Were they adopted? Especially if you're looking at same-sex families, like how did they have kids?
Mm-hmm.
Were they from previous relationships or surrogacy or whatever?
So you'd want to not only ask how many kids you have, but you would want to ask, what is the status, or what are some of the
like how did you have these kids?
Yeah. What are some of the
story?
Yeah. What are some of the elements or the factors that surround the kids that you have? Right? How many kids are living at home versus how many are already out the home? Right? How many kids? Do you have any kids with any type of medical challenges? How dependent are these kids? Right? So all of these become variables as I'm studying family, because these significantly influence family processes. Yes.
I think also like the age of the children and the age spread of the children
Yes.
and the developmental phases of the family.
That's exactly right? Because you have some of these bimodal families, right? So you have a situation where you may have a set of children who are grown and out the house, and then you have kind of so what is that? What do you call it?
The try again kids?
The try again.
That's what my brother was.
The summer surprise, where they're now raising a child or two, and so they're literally in two different sections of the family life cycle. So those are the types of things that you want to consider. Other things you would want to consider: employment status. Right. So, is it one person working? Is it two people working? So those would be important variables to consider as well. What we didn't mention, I think it's included in SES, but education is an important variable that we want to kind of consider as well. So all of these are variables. Now, additionally, you would also want to maybe have some small metric in terms of like family environment and maybe family communication. Even if it's not a central part of what you're trying to study, it becomes a variable that says that does become very important in terms of behavior. So, for example, even if I'm studying, say, for example, child aggression, right? A variable that I would want to consider is family environment, in addition to these other things, right? So these are all areas. So experimental research, we've talked about all of those pieces, and then finally applied research. And when we think about applied research, I put more focus, right? Because applied research could actually be utilized by any of these other types of methodologies. But the focus is really more practical than theoretical. They're really trying to, they've identified a very specific problem, and the reason that they're conducting the research is to be able to address that particular issue. It's a problem solving. methodology, right? And so data are gathered in an effort to solve problems, evaluate policies or programs, to estimate the outcome of some proposed future change in policy. So that's really the idea around applied research. Now, this raises a very interesting question when it comes in terms of couples and families. Because when we think about applied research, even within the family field, it's been largely still individual. And those individuals haven't always been representative of the larger issue that we're trying to address. And so one of the things that we kind of have to think about in applied research is who are the various individuals that would be important if I'm trying to solve this problem. So for example, there was some very interesting research that they were looking at maternity leave and how much leave should be given, right? But the people who they asked were employers and bosses, right? How much time do you think should be given, all right? And their responses were, I don't know, maybe a month, 3 months, right? And that was used to kind of then influence some policy that was there, right? And so again, as you think about these applied research questions, then it also says, well, if I'm trying to solve a problem, it becomes important that I actually am engaging the individuals who are going to best help me to help address this particular problem. So say, for example, we wanted to address an issue of bullying, right? And bullying within the school context, that's really high. And you are developing an applied research study. Who might be the individuals who you would want included in that study?
The bully and the bullied.
So we want the bully and bullied.
Yeah, the peers.
Right. We want peers.
You mentioned the parents because there's might be something.
We want parents. We want parents on both sides, probably.
So school-based setting, maybe the teachers and the administrators.
We want teachers and administrators.
Mm-hmm.
And so all of those are probably important stakeholders, right? And so again, now what's interesting is you've created a very, very complex design now, right? Because if you're going to be getting the bullied and the bullied, their parents, right, and their peers, and the teachers and the administrators, how do you even start to set up that design? And then how do you even start to analyze this information? Many of us would drop to qualitative very quickly, right? Because we're just doing interviews and we're just kind of looking. But if we're wanting to, again, and I agree, right, that we should do that. But if we really wanted to, if we wanted to influence larger policy, right, and really getting a larger representative sample, right, all of a sudden, we're now looking at not just a family or two, but now dozens of families, right? So if we have dozens of bullies and dozens of bulliers, or the bullied, and dozens of parents, and then dozens of peers, and dozens of teachers, how do we start to even begin to try to make all of that make sense? So there are, this is where when we, statistically speaking, this is where we kind of think about things like social network analysis, nested variables, right? So with these kind of nested variables, you actually take all of this information. And remember we talked last week about how you would, as opposed to setting up as an individual, as opposed to saying, okay, here's all the different bullies, and then here's all the different, bulliers, those who have been bullied, and here are the different parents, that you would actually set up all on the one variable, right? Now you have a super long variable, right? But then it allows you to then treat each of these individuals as a single interactive type of variable that you can then analyze in a much more sophisticated way. Right? other ways that you can kind of get it is to separate it into different groups, and then kind of take those aggregates and look at trends and patterns within those different groups. Mixed methods is always a good option to be able to kind of gravitate with both of those ideas. So there's different kind of analytic strategies that we can use to kind of start to get at it. But don't let that be cause you to shy away from asking these very relevant questions. So we've talked about quantitative methodologies, and so now we'll talk about qualitative methodologies. And so when we think about qualitative methodologies, there's basically 5 that we kind of think about: a narrative, phenomenological, grounded theory, ethnography, case study. You haven't had qualitative.
We're taking it.
We're taking it right now. Have you gone over these yet?
We've gone over
Can I have that card?
phenomenology.
Yes, please.
You sure I can. These I'm posting all the presentations on Canvas as well. But yeah, so the focus, data collection, data analysis, narrative form. So what is the focus? With narrative, exploring the life of an individual. You're kind of doing more in-depth analysis of an individual. Phenomenology, understanding evidence of experiences about a particular phenomenon, right? So you're more studying a particular phenomena that's taking place. So for example, you could do a phenomenological study around the role of depression within the family context. You can do something on the role of grief in relation to the Las Vegas shooting, right? That phenomena that took place, right? With grounded theory, the idea is you're gathering data with the intention of developing theory, right? So essentially, you're saying we don't know enough about this particular issue to really have any meaningful theories as why something is taking place. So the purpose of grounded theory is to gather enough data to start to allow yourself to develop some theory about what's happening. And there's different methodologies around grounded theory that you'll learn in your qualitative class. Ethnographies, when you describe or interpret something, what's happening at a cultural or social group, when you actually kind of almost embed yourself within a particular context with the goal of trying to understand a phenomenon. I have a friend of mine who's an ethnographer who has been studying individuals who have been released from prison and trying to understand why there's such high rates of recidivism. And so he's actually goes down and he interacts and he follows these individuals to try to understand how is it with all of the literally millions of dollars that are going into programs and transitions and all these different things, that the recidivism rate is still so high, right? And then he kind of talks about the various issues that kind of that he's identified as to why that's the case. And then case studies, developing an in-depth analysis of a single case or multiple cases. And usually it doesn't necessarily have to be clinical in nature, but more so of a particular phenomena that you're trying to observe. Data collection, primary interviews. These are longer interviews, up to 10 to 20 people. With grounded theory, typically you would want to get 20 to 30. You can probably, get away with, 15, 12 maybe, but typically speaking, you would want to get 20, 30. The reason for that is you want to get something called saturation. You'll talk about this more in your class. But essentially, you want the themes to basically start to become repetitive. So you're not necessarily gathering any new information. And so it's kind of hard to do that with low numbers. But as you get more numbers, you will start to get these repeated themes, and so you can say, okay, I think we've captured this particular phenomena well enough to kind of develop some theory. That's why you want to have enough of these things. Primary observations with interviews, additional artifacts during extended time in the field, right? So you're gathering, you're not just gathering information, but you're actually looking at police records, you're actually looking at other types of artifacts that would inform what's going on. So for example, one of the things that he does is he actually goes to a lot of these programs that help inmates who are transitioning and saying, well, they're getting all this money. What is going on that is still contributing to this high recidivism rate? One of the things that he found, which was interesting, just as a illustration, is he found that in one of the programs that they were trying to, often there's a very high substance use problem within those who are incarcerated. So one way that this program tried to address that was to say, well, there was a curfew, you have to be in by 6 p.m. Now, the challenge with that is that for many individuals who have felonies, it's hard for them to get jobs. And the jobs that they tend to get tend to be the jobs that no one else wants. Night jobs, swing shift jobs, warehouse jobs, working overnight. The challenge is, you want me to be in by 6 p.m., but my job doesn't start until 10 p.m. Right? And so you could not be in the program if you were out after 6 p.m. because they're saying, we don't know if you're out there getting high or on drugs. And so you have people who have that, and this program was providing housing and residence. So now you have these people who have to wrestle with, do I sacrifice my housing to get a job, right? Or do I not get the job to keep my housing, knowing in 90 days I'm going to be out on the street anyway? Right? And so again, it's this idea of, we start to kind of see, well, how is it that it creates these very difficult situations? So it's just kind of like, well, fine, I'll just, be homeless, right? And then I'll work my job, but then I don't have any place to stay. So who would I go to? I go to my old friends who are using, and I go back to my old friends who are using, and then I start using, then I get popped, and then I'm back in jail, right? And so on the outside, you don't always are able to kind of capture that, but by being able to live and be among these individuals, you're able to kind of pick up these pieces to say, this is why we're starting to see what we're seeing. And it's just kind of one example, and there's lots of other things that he kind of talks about. With case study, multiple sources, again, documents, archival records, interviews, observations, physical artifacts, all of those things that you kind of capture. In terms of data analysis, how I get it, you're looking at the stories, the historical content, the epiphanies. Essentially, you're just really conveying the story that no one else would hear if you weren't able to capture it. Right? So that's really the essence of it. With the phenomenology, you're getting a little bit more where you're taking particular statements and meanings and you're kind of creating some themes. You're not trying to develop a theory as much as you're just trying to kind of capture, so what was it like? So for example, if we take the Las Vegas shooting and kind of a phenomenological experience of what was going on, or we maybe take the Boston bombing that happened several years ago and what was happening with these different individuals and the meaning behind those things. So that would be an example of a phenomenological study, right? So if you saw the movie, was it Strong? Mm-hmm. Was that
something
Boston Strong?
Yeah.
Strong, something like that. No one knows what I'm talking about. Ruth knows what I'm talking about. Was it Mark Wahlberg in there? Who was the guy?
Yeah, he was.
Was it Mark?
Yeah,
who was the guy?
He was the cop that was.
It was
on
the cop. Yeah. Okay. No. Okay. Blink station. Okay. So it's a movie about Boston bombing and a guy who's recuperating, right? So this may be an example of a phenomenology, right? In order to develop this movie, they kind of gathered, the information from lots of different individuals in order to kind of get this story and what was this experience like. Okay. Grounded theory is when you're moving to, you actually just have a question. Someone who does grounded theory work, if those of you are familiar with Brene Brown, So Brene Brown, she does a lot of grounded theory work, right? So she goes out and asks questions. And I don't know if you've ever seen her 24-minute talk on Rave, or what do you call it? What do you call this thing? The Anatomy of Trust. The Anatomy of Trust. It's a great thing. If you TED Talk, it's great. Anyway, but she talks about how her approach to trying to understand trust. And the first thing was not to go to the literature and say, how do you define trust? But to actually talk with individuals. And what does trust mean to you, and how do you know you trust someone, and how do you know someone trusts you? So they ask all of these questions. They develop some theories around how trust happens, and then they went to the literature and said, does this line up with what we have already found? Is there things that we hadn't considered? So the idea is we start with a not knowing frame, and we just have a position of curiosity, and then move from there to finding out what other people have done. And she liked some of the work of John Gottman and some of the work that he had done around those different things. Right? The ethnography, I give description, analysis, interpretation. I gave you an illustration of that. And then description, themes, and assertions. So with the case study, you're now kind of making certain conclusions about, based on our study of this phenomenon. Here are a couple conclusions or some implications from what we're finding, right? And the difference between, say, for example, grounded theory and a case study is with grounded theory, you're letting the theme emerge. Where with a case study, you're kind of reading and saying, based on what my understanding, here's some conclusions that I'm making. And so those would be some of those differences. Narrative form, down at the bottom, how you're kind of gathering some of that information. So again, from a qualitative perspective, regardless of the perspective, as we think about couples and families, right? What things might we want to consider if we're moving beyond just interviewing the individual and actually starting to look at the couple or the family? What pieces would be important to think about? Right? And so it does go back to configurations, right? Who's in the room as we're doing the interview? Right? That would be a very important variable when it comes to a narrative approach, because the assumption is who the person in the room is going to influence the narrative that I tell. And so that does become a very important consideration as I think about setting up my study. The other thing that we think about, again, just in terms of our orientation, is that our question oftentimes begs to broaden our lens, right? So for example, with Brene Brown and her study of trust, if the question was now expanded to, what does trust mean within the relational context? I would then say, well, I wouldn't want to interview more than just the person. I would maybe want to interview the people around that person as well. And so again, it's just we're bringing in a particular lens and allowing that lens to guide how we even think about forming the question. So with that being the case, we'll then kind of talk about how do we kind of take theory and research and evidence and kind of pull all those things together. How do these things kind of work together? Because it is important to kind of think about theory as we kind of conduct research. And how does relational theories influence some of those things? So theory considers the nature of a problem, right? So a situation, something transitional or chronic. Research describes and tests the effectiveness of an intervention, right? So theories consider would theorize how do problems happen, right? The research actually tests, well, what happens, how do we actually treat that problem and the effectiveness of an intervention? Theory considers the context of a problem, while research describes and evaluates the effectiveness of an intervention within these contexts, right? So the theory says, what is the context of where this is taking place? The research says, well, let's describe this context. Let's evaluate what's happening in this context and what type of intervention would be useful. Theory considers the goal, for example, of treatment. Research focuses on the outcome of that intervention. So theoretically, okay, so for example, everyone had theory. I assume everyone just had theory. So we all know aware that each therapeutic model has different therapeutic goals, right? Okay. So what is the therapeutic goal? What is the therapeutic goal of Bowen family systems theory?
To increase
Differentiation.
Yes. Differentiation.
Differentiation, right? So you want to increase differentiation, right? That's the therapeutic goal, right? Differentiation, right? What about structural family therapy? What is the therapeutic goal?
To change the structure to get the, like if it's a parental system, getting the parental system in the executive.
Like a power
system.
shift, whoever has the power in the family.
Right. So to make sure that there's appropriate boundaries, right, within the family, right? The executive subsystem, is there, and it is the most the primary system among the other systems. That the boundaries that are not too rigid or too
Open? No.
diffuse, right? So you want some flexible boundaries. Okay, what about narrative therapy? What's the therapeutic goal of narrative therapy? Yes.
To find your preferred narrative.
To identify the preferred narrative, right? That we have this problem-saturated narrative, right? But this problem-saturated narrative is not what I want, but it's the narrative I'm living. What is your preferred narrative? To provide a narrative that empowers and encourages, the desire the thing that I desire for myself. The preferred narrative. Okay. So theory considers the goal of treatment, right? Research focuses on the outcome of that treatment, right? So meaning, right, that as we think about theories, right? Research says, look, I'm all about your theory. I'm glad, but let's test it. Right? Let's actually see whether differentiation is an important role in whether or not someone is well adjusted. And so that then becomes part of the question that gets asked. Let's see if boundaries are in place and they aren't too rigid or diffuse, whether that results in a family that functions relatively well. Right? So the research says, I'm all about your theory, but let's evaluate the theory to see whether or not it could be substantiated. And there are some things that indeed are found and other things that aren't found to be necessarily as important as we think about some of these things. And then finally, theory considers how change happens. Research examines the various mechanisms that contribute to change. Right? So this is how these ideas are kind of linked together.
And you're going to post that so we'll have access to that chart?
Yes. Okay. So linking theory and research. And so if we were looking at domestic violence, for example, right? So we could look at these various theories: functionalist theory, conflict theory, symbolic interactionist theory. All of these are all theories that you're learning in your family theories courses. And you can kind of look how these theories would influence the particular method of research that you would use, and it would influence kind of the questionnaire, the rationale behind it, right? That the theory oftentimes influences my methodology, and it influences the reasoning behind it, right? So why am I choosing this particular methodology? Because this theory would suggest that this is how I'm going to best get at this particular question. So for example, a questionnaire, we're looking at domestic violence, right? One research method would be a questionnaire on domestic violence is sent to a national random sample of individuals living in safety homes and domestic violence treatment centers. The survey examines a possible relationship between incidents of domestic violence and environmental stressors. And so this will be a kind of a survey type of idea. Conflict theory, with conflict theory, the idea with conflict theory is that there are the model suggests that there are particular interactive variables that are contributing to conflict, right? So if I'm going to get at that, a survey may not be able to kind of capture that. So my methodology would probably be more case study, right? Because I'm more interested in kind of getting at these more on the ground interactive levels, right? Because the theory would say that's where the action is going to be happening, right? And so a particular city with high levels of domestic violence is examined with respect to the relationship between domestic violence and environmental stressors. Researchers interview law enforcement, social service workers, and couples to try to understand what may be the factors that are contributing to the domestic violence. Symbolic interactionist theory, the idea is, that the interactions, have various meanings that then contribute to certain behaviors and things along those lines. Well, based on that, if the power is in the interaction, then I want to use a methodology that's going to not allow me to influence the interaction, right? Some may be going to use a participant observation approach, because theoretically it says if I interfere too much with the interaction, then I'm going to distort what I'm trying to find. So I want to be as naturalistic as possible, right? And so with that, concealing my identity, Arisa takes a temporary job at a housing project with lots of reported incidents of domestic violence. They attempt to observe a possible link between domestic violence and other stress-related environmental factors. Right? So I want to now just kind of move in and kind of and I want to influence, I want to see and just observe what's going on without trying to influence what's happening, right? Particularly with domestic violence, right? You can't really bring that into a lab and observe it, right? It would be unethical to do that anyway, right? So you wouldn't want to do it. And so again, this is where, based on what you're trying to get at in your theory, it's going to also influence your methodology. Right? All of these methods are valid, right? But this methodology is actually driven by the theory. And the theory, the reason that the methodology is driven by theory, because what is the goal of this, right? So now let's take this and bring it down to some of the theories that we're familiar with. Right? You'll get this in family theories at a broad level, but in terms of family therapy theory, right? If we were going to take attachment theory, and we're going to study attachment theory within the therapeutic context, right? What methodologies would you think would be best suited to try to capture that type of information? So not the theory, because attachment theory is the theory we're looking at. What methodologies?
Observation.
So observation would be one. Mm-hmm. What else? There may be others.
Case study.
You could probably get at it with the case study.
An interview, maybe either a verbal or a paper interview.
So surveys are interesting, right? Because the question then becomes, if I'm studying, it comes back to the question, right? If I want to get at my perception of our attachment, then I think a survey would be appropriate. If I want to observe the quality of the attachment, then I actually may want to do more of an observation, or maybe even some type of clinical types of intervention, right, where I'm actually working with them.
And I think if you're doing a combination of those in some way, it's like the order in which you pursue those is important, because you can actually load things.
That's right.
Without intending to do so.
You
And
get the prize for the day.
That is like it's like, how do you control for that?
Well, but that's exactly it. But that's how we think about it. So Tony highlights an outstanding point, which is this idea of, truth be told, many of these methods aren't done in isolation. Right? When you look at Susan Johnson's work, when you look at Christensen's work, when you look at Gottman's work, they're using several of these methodologies. The reason is, right, that all these methodologies have strengths and they have limitations. If I use multiple methodologies, right, the reason I'm using multiple methodologies is because my question's a little bit different, right? And the reason my question's a little bit different is each question's going to yield a little bit different data, right? So I want to use different methods because they're going to give me different data that would help me get a full picture. Now, Tony's point, which is, okay, yes, this is true, but it does become important on which methodologies are used and at what point, and do we even use them on the same sample, right? So one of the, when we look at one of the threats to validity is learning, right? So, and learning is, if I expose someone to certain information, then it may not, the change that takes place may not be due to the intervention. It may be due to the fact that I was introduced or I was provided this information, which the information itself actually influenced, and not necessarily my intervention. And so that becomes an important variable that we would definitely want to kind of keep in mind and consider. Okay. Oh man, time's against us. We're only halfway through this thing. Okay, so
Talk faster.
so the next part, hopefully this next part is kind of review for you, right? So research methods. Hopefully this is kind of a little bit of review. So I think we can move through this. So research couples with methods and families. So this is, again, as you think about your paper, as you think about your presentation, first choose a topic, right? Just very broadly, just find something that you're interested in. Now, many of you mentioned things that you have interest in, right? So choose a topic. Once you've chosen a topic, ask a question. And so the question really becomes the important thing that you want to start to drill in. Am I asking the right question for what I'm trying to find? So, so that's one of the, as I talk with students or even colleagues and we're wrestling, this is what we're, the topic's oftentimes easy to kind of get, right? It's the question that you end up really spending time on, because as you're sitting down and asking the question, you have to kind of say, is the answer to this question what I'm trying to get at, right? So almost sometimes you have to reverse engineer in some ways of saying, well, what am I hoping to get out of this? And if I'm hoping to get this out of this, what is the question I need to ask? Yes?
One thing that comes up, though, does that lead to a temptation where you're going from that approach to have any sort of bias, where you're like, okay, this is my agenda, this is what I'm wanting to see?
It's a good question. So there's a difference between here's what I am wanting to look at, right? And here's what I want to find.
Yeah.
Right? So I want to, so for example, say my topic is, if we stay with attachment, right? So I want to study the impact of attachment. Or let's say intimacy, because all of my illustrations are going to be about intimacy. Okay, so I want to understand intimacy, right? So my topic is going to be intimacy. Now, my what may be, what is the influence, here's my question here, what is the influence of non-erotic physical affection on emotional intimacy? So that's my question, right? Maybe what I want to find is, I think there's a relationship between non-erotic physical affection and intimacy. I think there's something there, right? Now, I don't want to go as far as to say, I think I will find that, non-erotic physical intimacy will, that maybe, you can make that your hypothesis and test it, right? But you can't get so invested in it that you start to, not be honest to the data.
Yeah.
Right? And so you do have to kind of look at it. But if I know that, if my thought is, I think that non-erotic physical affection, and non-erotic physical affection is like back rubs, holding hands, hugs, things that aren't necessarily associated with eroticism, things like that. I guess you can argue, but anyway, most people don't. Anyway, so but most people are not gonna go that far down the road, right? Probably, okay. So non-erotic physical affection, and does that kind of contribute to emotional intimacy? Because oftentimes when we think about intimacy, we think about it more in terms of a sexual way, or those types of things. So do these other things contribute to? So I think it does. Right? So that's my thought. So based on that, how is that going to now inform my question? Right? So sometimes you can kind of get at your question if you know what you're trying to kind of get at. Right? So a topic in this case, couples and intimacy. My question: what impact does non-erotic physical affection have on couple emotional intimacy? Now, one of the things that we start to do is we start to go through our 5 W's. And we start to ask, well, who do I want to ask this question to? Do I want to ask it to individuals? Do I want to ask it to couples? Do I want to ask it to couples married less than a year who are newlyweds? Do I want to ask it to couples who are been married for 10 years or more? Do I want to ask this do I want to ask this among couples who are in distress? Or, so who do I want to ask this question to is one of those, is something that I start to kind of wrestle with, right? Do I want to ask it among a particular subset? African American couples, or couples who are experiencing medical challenges, it's couples who are experiencing some level of sexual dysfunction, right? So because there's a theory around sexuality and intimacy, and if there's impotency or vaginismus or things along those lines, then does that influence? Or what if it could just be a variable that we need to consider, right? So who do I want to talk to is one of the first things I kind of start to think about. The reason that becomes important is that starts to narrow down my sampling frame, right? Oftentimes we come up with a great question, but we really haven't thought about the sample, and it's kind of like, well, who are you going to get this information from? It's kind of like, oh, I ain't thought about that, right? So even, for example, like people say, well, I like to study military families. That's still very broad, right? Like who, active military, retired military, so who exactly am I trying to kind of get at, right? So that's the first question you ask. And then what, right? So what in terms of description, like, what is it that I'm trying to accomplish? What is my design that I want to use? What is the process that I'm going to use? Meaning, so for each couple, am I going to interview the couples separately? Am I going to interview them together? Am I going to, do qualitative interviews? Or am I going to do quantitative, right? So what is going to be my process? What are going to be my outcome variables, right? So for example, if I'm talking about emotional intimacy, what does that actually mean? How am I defining emotional intimacy? How am I measuring emotional intimacy? How am I measuring non-erotic physical affection, right? So the what is really kind of the meat of what I'm trying to wrestle with, right? So, who am I going to do it, but then what am I going to do, right? What type of methodology I'm going to use, what type of design I'm going to use, what type of process I'm going to use, am I going to give them incentives? All of these is kind of in the what, in terms of the description, the process, the outcome. Next is where. Where am I going to do this research, right? Am I going to be in a controlled setting, right? So it can be more of an experiment. Is it going to be where I'm going to invite them in, and I'm going to talk with them about their non-erotic physical affection practices, right? Is it a more naturalistic observational setting, right? So am I going to the park, and just stalking folks, right? And just kind of watching, And then after I watch them for 30 minutes, then I engage them and ask them, can I do an interview with them for a while, right? So
I'm watching you.
We do that. Did people do that? Yeah. So naturalistic, even geography and setting, right? So so if I do it, what part of the country am I doing it in? Or what country am I doing it in? So that becomes an important piece. Geographically, what happens? How might that be a variable? But geographically, the social norms and expectations may be different depending on where you are geographically. So that becomes important. Setting becomes important, right? Is this happening in a church setting? Is this happening in a community setting? Is this happening in what about among, a senior retirement village? So all of these things, what type of setting is it taking place in? And am I capturing, because all of these pieces are going to influence, various elements and dimensions of the data. Right? When am I going to do this information? So for example, am I going to use secondary data? Am I going to look at archives or records and use that as part of it? Am I going to do it as part of a larger program? When someone comes in for counseling, right? For example, am I going to do it during that time? with the clinical population. Even things like time of day. You know, am I doing it first thing in the morning? Am I doing it in the day? Am I doing it on the weekends? You know, all of those types of things become important of what I'm doing. And then why? What do I hope to accomplish as a result of this? Right? So I actually helped publish an article and book chapter looking at this. And the purpose was, it's in a book called Low Cost Approaches to Couple and Family Therapy. And so the argument that we were making is, you know, well, if you're not, you know, if you can't afford to see a therapist, if you do these things, this is likely to improve, you know, your relationship. So that was the kind of takeaway, low cost approaches, you know, to mental health. Okay, so we'll look at some of those areas. Okay, so once you have that, depending on the methodology that you're using. So for example, if you're doing grounded theory, then you would not actually do a lit review, right? If you're doing grounded theory, you actually set up your interview and do your interview. If you're doing a more quantitative study, then you would actually do your lit review next. And you'll start to say, what does the literature have to say? So this is what you should be doing now, right? So, well, first let me know what your topic is. Once you know what your topic, and then know what your question is. But, you know, and well, okay, you should be doing step 1 and 2 now, right? Okay, because the next thing you would want to do is, as I talked about last week, sometimes we think we have super awesome questions, and then we go to the literature and it's like, oh yeah, this was done like 20 years ago, right? So you want to go to the literature. What does the literature already say? And then oftentimes the literature would tell you, what the next question should be, okay? So as you get to the end of an article, it says, here's what we found. The next thing we need to look at is X. Yeah.
I guess so. Part of this question, but going into our paper as well. So what if there isn't a lot of specific literature on your specific topic?
So 2 things. 1, good, or bad.
Right.
So I'll start with the bad first.
Okay.
So bad meaning it's not an issue that's important enough for people to really care about. Like maybe so specific that, you know, its utility is minimal. Or we may not be asking the right question.
Okay.
Right. So that may be piece. So that's the bad. The good is the world is so big that there's a lot of untouched soil out there that people haven't just bothered to ask the question. And particularly now, where our sensitivities around issues that weren't as at the forefront maybe 15 or 20 years ago, the questions that are now being asked now aren't just questions that weren't even on the radar before. So for example, I was looking at there's a software called what is it called? Simple Practice. Simple Practice is a software for therapists who are in private practice. And so I was looking at, we're just reviewing it, and we're looking at the gender category. And
It's very limited. I have that product. I use that product.
They've expanded it.
They're starting to.
They're starting to. So they have male, female, but then they have trans, female to male, trans, male to female, which, while limited, is still vastly more than male, female, right? So it is interesting to put down some.
We've been asking for that for a while.
For a while, I know. So, and I guarantee 10 years ago, they would have been like, yeah, there's no. But now, so oh yeah, we want to be, it becomes relevant now. You know, I think this is, and so I think piece of it is the questions start to get asked as things become more relevant. And so when you go to the literature, if it hasn't been addressed, one of the questions you want to start asking yourself is, has it not been addressed because it wasn't necessarily relevant? Or on the bad side, has no one asked this question because it's not relevant, right? So you're probably not going to find a lot of things in the literature about, attachment patterns on Mars, right? And you can say, but how come there isn't? Well, because it's at this stage, it's not a very relevant question. So you can get all hot and heavy about it, but at the end of the day, it's like, no one cares. No one's going to give you any money to do that. But looking at attachment pattern among individuals who have gone under transitions, and the role that plays into their intimate relationships, that's a very relevant question now, right? And we don't know hardly anything about it, and you're not going to find a lot in the literature about it, right? So I think so you have to start kind of teasing out what, if there's a limited literature, what may be contributing to the limited literature, and if it seems like it's probably just because of the question hasn't really been answered or hasn't been asked, then it becomes valid. You know, again, a reference a review that I did for 30 years. I did a 30-year lit review and found only 40-something articles over 30 years ever used a couple of analysis, and half of those are qualitative articles, right? And so it's kind of, to me, I thought I was going to buy hundreds of articles, right? And I was like, how is it in 30 years? That's literally almost barely 1.5 articles a year that looked at that. You know? So
I've kind of a general question now that we're on the topic of lit reviews. Do you have a certain strategy that you use when you're doing lit review?
So depends on the type of lit review. So there's different types of literature reviews, right? So you have narrative literature reviews, systematic literature reviews. So it all depends on the type of lit review you're trying to do. There are we can talk.
Okay, so I know some people have they have graphs, or they have Excel spreadsheets and stuff like that.
Yeah. So my poster. You want to just know my poster process?
No, you don't have to have your personal one. Just suggestions of because I know it can be overwhelming for sure. Just going into EBSCO and typing in phrase, and then you get 10,000.
Yes.
Kind of teasing what actually is a good article that you would use.
Depending on the question, typically what I tend to do is I do my initial lit review. I do my list. I come up with my key. Okay. So you come up with your key terms, right? And you want your key terms to be exhaustive. Right? Matter of fact, we're gonna talk about it next week. No, we're gonna talk about more evaluation next week. Okay. So you set up your key terms, right? And you're exhaustive, right? So for example, when I did my review article, I did couples and diabetes. Couple and diabetes, spouse and diabetes, spouses and diabetes, wife and diabetes, husband and diabetes, dyad and diabetes, dyadic and diabetes, and so you just kind of go on. Then you use all those terms with TD2, TD1, right? Because those are abbreviations for diabetes. So you develop this exhaustive kind of key term search, and you just search each one. Now we have librarians who this is what they do for a living. So I know they do it for the faculty. I don't know if they do it for students. I think I would ask anyway. But so now I'll just go and say, here's my search terms. Could you look at those? Hey, pull these up for me. And they're like, yeah, I mean that's what they do. That's what they do. So when I was a student, I was up late at night doing it myself. But I don't know. I think they may do it for students. Is I would try to kind of say, hey, here's my search terms. Could you? Hopefully. Anyway, so first thing, so I get all my articles, and then I just kind of do, I do a pass. First I do a title pass, right? So I look at the title and see if it's relevant, right? So for example, when I did that, there was dyadic, chromosomes in relation to type 2 diabetes. Okay. So you quickly do a title pass to see that things that are clearly not relevant, and then you do an abstract pass, right? So then you read the abstracts to see whether or not they fit what you're trying to kind of get at. If it's a decent abstract, then you should be able to get a decent sense of what the article is going to give you, and you can kind of separate out. So you have definitely no, and then maybes, right? And then the maybes, you have to maybe go to the method section. Right? So once I do the abstracts, then I would go into. Typically, I go into the methods, and look at the method section. Because usually when you're looking at review articles, that's kind of the essence of you're oftentimes reporting in methods and findings. Right? So I look at the methods and results, right? and then when I'm really ready to write, then I may go into the discussion and the introduction. But the meat of any article is the methods and the results. For that reason, you have to learn how to read stats, right? Because you gotta see what the results mean and see if sometimes folks keep making stuff up, right? And people aren't familiar with stats, right? So yeah, that sounds right, looks right, and they're not really looking at it. And then also you can't always go on the abstract, unfortunately. There was one article that it was like, the title was hot, abstract was like on point, but it was published, and we will talk about this next week. But it was published in like some journal in New Zealand, and I was just like, well, I don't know. So I paid $15. This is back in the day when you had to pay for stuff. $15 to get the article from that journal, from some library someplace, and I get it. It was garbage. It's pure garbage. So I was reading this. I said, "This is trash." No one knows. Okay, nothing against the journal in New Zealand, but obviously it wasn't a journal. So I was really disappointed. I spent a lot of money for something I didn't use. So okay, so yes, we'll talk about next week how to kind of look at the quality of an article and evaluate it. Okay. Okay, so family therapy journals. This is where you kind of start. Books a second, right? So first, the articles first, books second. The reason for that is articles are oftentimes more recent and relevant than books, right? So relevant, family therapy, family studies journals, books. Then you can go, depending on how exhaustive you want to go with the lit review, you can go with interviews, right? So you may pull an interview from a couple or a researcher or a therapist about the topic, right? A conference paper, things along those lines. And then even popular articles, newspaper, something from Psychology Today or Newsweek or something that was, because they sometimes publish interesting pieces. But usually you're gonna most of your work is gonna come here, unless you're just going Eye of the Tiger. You probably would usually go like that. Okay, after you have that and you've gone through your literature, then I start to come up with my hypothesis. And so my hypothesis would be couples who engage in frequent non-erotic physical affection will report higher levels of emotional intimacy versus those couples who do not. So this is my hypothesis. This is what I believe I would find based on the literature and based on my theoretical understanding of things. What's my research plan? So now we'll come up with my plan. What is going to be the best method to be able to collect my data? What's going to be the best method to do that? What timeline do I need to? How long is it going to take me? And again, as you think about your dissertation guide, listen. Most of you, all of you, I'm going to say all of you are young. So all of you are young, and so you have your whole career in terms of professionally. You have your whole career ahead of you to solve the problems of the world, right? Really, I mean, trust me. You don't have to solve them in this program, right? In this program, take one small piece and get out of here, right? And get out of here, right? And so people will pay you to solve the problems in the world, right? And so we want to find, put together a timeline that's realistic, right? That put together a timeline that has allowed you to ask a meaningful question, to develop a good experience, but then doesn't keep you here for 5 years, right? You don't want it to be so big that ends up, taking a lot longer than you want it to be. And then again, going back to your population, we've talked about that. Methods: survey, interviews, secondary analysis. I will conduct my research over a period of 2 weeks, right? So so say for example, I have access to a couple couples clinics. And then I'm going to ask the therapists at those clinics to simply give the questionnaire to these individuals, to every patient that comes in over the next 2 weeks. Boom, there's my data. I wish it was that nice, but for the sake of example. And then my population, 150 couples. When you do your stats course, you'll learn how to do a power analysis, so that depending on how many variables you have, it will let you know how many individuals you need to have in your study. As you collect your data, you go out, you do your research, then you start to kind of look at your variables, your independent variable and your dependent variable. This is quantitative research. If you're doing qualitative research, you collect your data, you do your transcripts and start coding, right? So depending on what your methodology is. In this case, we did a qualitative study. So the variable non-erotic physical affection, that was the independent variable, we did both separate variables and a composite variable. So separate variables, we looked at back rubbing separately, we looked at feet rubbing separately, hugs separately, hand holding separately, right? So we looked at all those things separately. But then we did a composite variable. Individuals who did all of these things, and we just called it non-erotic physical affection. So we looked at all those different variables, and then and how it impacted intimacy, right? And the variable for intimacy that we used, and the scale that we used. Analyze the data. So analyze your data. Look for the following: patterns and relationships, correlations, and causations, right? And in stats, you'll talk about the difference between causation and correlation. So pattern, a majority of few couples engage in patterns. Do we see a majority of few couples engaging in non-erotic physical affection? So what types of patterns do we see there? Relationship. Couples who engage in non-erotic physical affection cause a better emotional intimacy in relationships. So is this actually a causal factor, right? That couples who engage in this, actually it causes them to be closer. It's probably more of an association, but just for illustrative purposes. Correlation, I found a positive correlation between non-erotic physical affection and emotional intimacy, which is the more likely scenario, which is that those who have high emotional intimacy also are positively correlated with non-erotic physical affection. Conclusions. So what generalizations can be drawn from our research, right? And then was your hypothesis proven correct or incorrect? And then finally, my hypothesis was proven correct. So we did find that non-erotic physical affection did contribute to emotional intimacy. Generalization, couples who engage in non-erotic physical affection tend to report better emotional intimacy. Right? And so now I can use this as a potential intervention as I work with couples, is to say, hey, each week I want you to spend a little bit of time and give me just a back rub. It doesn't have to lead to anything. Just go ahead and just back rub, but get to grab those feet. So right now, I'm going to IFTA, International Family Therapy Association, in March. Yeah.
In Bangkok?
Yeah. You go.
I'm thinking I got my. Anyways, I'm gonna do a presentation there. Was accepted, but I'm trying to see if I'm gonna make it. But that's cool.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. We should.
Yeah.
Okay, so.
You guys are carpool.
You drive?
You try.
You're presenting, right?
Yeah, I was thinking. Yeah. Well, yeah.
Yeah. Well, yes, your department giving you some money to go.
No, but that would be really amazing if that was an option.
Okay, I don't know, but we're fine.
Okay, we'll talk.
Well, yeah. Okay. So, so I'm presenting on parental religiosity and parent-child relationships. And one of the implications that I'm making is that we found that that couples who reported higher levels of prayer, parents who reported high levels of prayer, church attendance, Bible study, and family worship had tended to have parenting styles that were supportive of positive parent-child relationships. And so one of the implications that I'm bringing is that obviously we're not trying to proselytize, but it's an underutilized resource for therapists. Now, if you're working with a family that religion is something that's important to them, that it becomes an easy way of helping the family to support their already established religious beliefs while at the same time helping to support positive parent-child relationships. So the idea, for example, the idea of praying with your child, or having family worship where we sit down and we are sharing with each other, and all of those things are attachment building events. It makes sense, right? And so if I'm reading stories to my child, all of these things are useful. So again, that's some of the correlations that we're making, right? That we're saying that even after you control for age and all these things that we talked about, that these variables still had a very powerful role in how parents interacted with their kids. Okay, we're finished here for today. Next week we will get into evaluation and how do we evaluate research and evidence, and then from there we will transition to the different topics. Thanks for if you have not responded to my email about which topics you would be interested in hearing, you can do that today so I can correlate all that and then kind of get that back out to you to let folks know where we are, and then we work on this Canvas stuff.
Thanks.
All right, thank you. I will see you next week.
Did you have a bio salad? Want it?
Yeah, but I need to like do a special report to make sure there's no fish sauce.
Oh, okay. Because I was gonna ask that question, but I'm like,
Yeah.
Are you why?
Yeah.
I don't feel like
I'm definitely gonna. I want to go. Like right now.
did you go?
I didn't have to.
Yeah. Or do you want us to order there?
You didn't have to, but did you?
Any class before 3?
I know, but
We're just gonna go get it to go and then come back here. Where are you gonna go?
You need to work for my car, so
I got it. I thought you were gonna
For class?